All right. Well, hello, everyone. Hope you're having a good conference and you've had a chance to get a bite to eat or stretch your legs. This is the panel called Biophilic Infrastructure, Letting Nature Lead the Way. If you're looking for Pave It All, How to Ruin the Planet and Die Trying, I think you're in the wrong session. You could try like COP35 or the American Asphalt Association or something. Anyway, so I just wanted to get things started really quickly, and then we'll introduce our illustrious panelists and dive in. So we've called this session Biophilic Infrastructure, which is a phrase that we actually made up for this session, although I've since seen it here and there. And I thought maybe we'd start by just unpacking that. So green or natural infrastructure is fairly well understood. Green infrastructure tends to refer to like urban design elements that are living replacements for gray counterparts. So that's like bioswales near parking lots for water filtration and cleaning, things like that. The phrase natural infrastructure usually refers to the ecosystem components that provide benefits to us. That's the way we think about it. Another phrase is ecosystem services. An example, healthy forests provide clean drinking water, carbon sequestration. It's a little bit of a mechanistic view and has legitimate critiques, but it's also in some ways a very useful view. Now then, we've also added biophilia in here, which is a term I'm guessing most Bioneers attendees are familiar with. For those who aren't, that's the term that E.O. Wilson is credited with coining that refers to our innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. Because this is Bioneers, we thought we'd try to kick the conversation around infrastructure up a notch by combining all three of these concepts, bringing in the idea of biomimetic design and the idea of a healthy and thriving natural world in its own right into the fold. Which we're definitely not going to get to all of this in 75 minutes. What we're painting is a really big set of questions. But we're going to have a great time talking about it. And we had a really good time thinking through who might be a great group of folks to talk this through with. So let me quickly introduce our panelists here. So if the screen is correct, below me is Dr. Crystal Colden, who's an assistant professor of fire science and the management of complex systems at UC Merced, and she's a former wildland firefighter. Crystal conducts research on how humans can mitigate catastrophic wildfire disasters while embracing and acknowledging fire as our ancestors did. She lives in rural California where she burns the land to heal it. I think she's also a mom and lovely to speak with. Hi, Crystal.
Hi.
Let's see, then to my, I don't know, it's to my other side here, I might be switched on the screen, is Aria Whitson, who's the Director of Community and Education at the organization called Tree People in LA. She leads and manages Tree People's environmental education, water equity, and community organizing departments, supporting thousands of community members across Southern California, with a focus on environmentally and economically stressed communities that have faced historic environmental injustice, actively participating in initiatives focused on climate change solutions, reforestation, water security, fire resilience, urban soils, waste management, and planting a healthy urban tree canopy. Ariel, you seem like a very busy person.
It's true. I'm sure we all are.
And then down to the bottom corner is Ben Goldfarb, who's a journalist and author of the book Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, which won the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Award. Ben's work has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, Science, Orion Magazine, The Washington Post, also on Bioneers.org, I will say. Ben lives in Spokane, Washington with his wife and his dog Kit, which is, of course, what one calls a baby beaver. That's fun.
Yeah, they're out for a hike right now, so.
Yes. All right. Well, hey, thank you all for joining us, especially here on a Saturday. It really means a lot to have you here. My name is Teo Grossman. I'm the Director of Programs and Research at Bioneers, and it's really great to have everyone here and to get to dive in. So please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. We'll try to drop them in throughout, and I'll definitely make sure to leave some time at the end to get into it. So I wanted to get going by asking kind of a provocative question at first, which is to maybe assume for a moment that we're able to brush away all the reasons that we can't achieve what we think needs to happen. It's pretend, but the concept is that if we can't imagine a livable future, we're definitely not going to get there. And so I thought maybe we'd start off by asking you guys to just let go of money and politics and feasibility for a hot second and think about what's the dream. Can you give us a quick sketch of what your work in the world looks like if it all went really well? And I think I was going to start with Ben, so maybe you can dive in.
Yeah, I mean, beavers everywhere is what I imagine. No, I mean, beavers, we know are kind of the ultimate creators of biophilic infrastructure, right? What do beavers do? They build dams. Those dams create ponds and wetlands, and those ponds and wetlands do all kinds of wonderful things. They're incredible fish and wildlife habitat. They create fire breaks and fire refugia. They sequester carbon. They capture pollution. They store water, mitigating both drought and flood. They're kind of these miracle structures in some ways. We also know that beaver populations today are a tiny fraction of their historic capacity, right? When Europeans showed up in North America, there were as many as 400 million beavers on this continent, creating dams and ponds and wetlands everywhere, and now there are perhaps 10 million. So we're at a very small fraction of our historic population numbers. And we also know that when Europeans showed up, this continent was much lusher, greener, bluer, wetter than it is today. And, are we going to get back to 400 million beavers ever? Probably not. But, we can certainly dramatically increase our populations from where they are. So to me, that's what success looks like moving forward. Is it half of our historic beaver populations? I don't know what number you want to put on it, but a dramatically increased beaver population, creating the kinds of biophilic infrastructure that we know historically predominated in North America, and that we need so badly to solve lots of our ecological problems today. So more beavers on the landscape is what I'm looking for.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Ariel, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I think for me, it really is a movement that reconnects everyone. I mean, everyone between, people and land and nature. And we all consider that as we go forward in any respective, industry that we're in. And we prioritize nature-based solutions instead of gray infrastructure, right? And we understand that people have a voice and they want to have a voice, and community members want to be at that table because they know their communities best. So it's integrating community at every level. And I think it also starts with looking at solutions without those parameters sometimes, Teo, we can't do it because of this. We can't do it because of that. Quite often I see solutions that don't center, first of all, our soil is unhealthy, our water is unhealthy, our air is unhealthy. So we have to think about restoration and regeneration first before we can say, all right, we're going to build all this stuff on top of it, right? It has to come back to fundamentally cleaning, and getting back to restoring before we can say we're going to build all of this other stuff on top of it. So it's really, really taking it to that fundamental level and prioritizing the voices of Indigenous people who have always done this, right? So that for me, if we could think about all of our problems intersectionally and think about our solutions, restoring that intrinsic land and people together, that's what a healthy vision of the future looks like.
Awesome. Thank you, Ariel. Crystal, you want to take a whack?
Sure. So I'm a fire scientist, as Teo mentioned, and My vision of the future includes a lot more fire. And it very much builds on what Ben and Ariel have described, which is this world that is hearkening back to what it was prior to sort of the contemporary capitalist and Western European approach taking over the landscape and trying to control nature, right? And trying to control fire was one of the fundamental tenets of expansion and sort of European colonization globally. But when we look at the world prior to that colonization process, what we see is that almost every indigenous population globally has origin stories and a relationship with the land that includes a very strong relationship with fire. And so bringing fire back to our landscapes is a really critical element of moving forward and creating essentially a sustainable fabric of earth. It has to burn. And that fire has so many reasons for being there, right? And Ariel talked about cleaning up. That's what fire does, right? And it's this renewal, it's this rejuvenation, and we need to have that renewal and rejuvenation in order to continue to progress and be sustainable on this planet, because we need the planet much more than it needs us.
Thanks, Crystal. That's great. Wow, this is like a place I'd like to live, I think. Maybe we'll get there. So look, we're going to return to what this is, hopefully through the course of this session, we'll kind of unpack what it might take to get to some of these visions. And I think in some ways there's some hope, which we were all discussing before the panel, actually. There's, it's a funny world we're living in. And there are many reasons for hope as not, despite what you might read in the papers. So let's dive in. Ben, you kind of briefly jumped into the history of beavers in North America. I was wondering if you could spend a little while longer on that, kind of expanding. We're such a short-lived species in some ways, even though we think we know so much. But from my understanding, what North America really looks like now is actually in some ways a far cry from what it might have looked like when it was sufficiently beavered. So I wonder if you could spend some time, a few minutes diving into that.
Yeah, it's really incredible when you read old trappers' journals and explorers' diaries and native histories, just how lush this landscape was. You read Lewis and Clark describing seeing beaver dams as far as the eye could see up every tributary of the Missouri Basin. You read about explorers, crossing what is today Indiana and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had so thoroughly ponded everything up. And it's just kind of incredible to think about what a productive landscape that was. Beavers. Every just name a species, and it benefits from the kinds of habitats beavers create, right? Amphibians, other aquatic mammals, salmonids, songbirds, waterfowl, all would have found a place to live on that beaver created landscape. And I think that one important thing to remember too is, now there's this kind of beaver believer movement. There are lots of Western scientists, talking about how important it is that we restore some semblance of that landscape. But, as Crystal was saying about fire and the deep native connection to fire, certainly the notion that the landscape that beavers create is important. That's not a new notion to Western science, right? That's something that that native people have understood for many thousands of years. And Rosalind Lapierre, who's a great Blackfeet historian and ethnographer and ethnobotanist, has written about how the Blackfeet actually sanctified beavers and had cultural prohibitions against killing them, precisely because they understood that beavers were creating these ecological oases in otherwise arid Montana landscapes. So in some ways, I think that the modern beaver restoration movement is just remembering or rediscovering what native people have known for a very long time, but which we had forgotten because beginning in the early 1600s, the industrial fur trade basically set to systematically wiping beavers out of every river, lake, stream, and pond fur traders and trappers encountered, and in so doing dramatically changed the landscape from kind of this wet wonderland to a much more arid one. So, that's what we're trying to do today, is to get back to that point. What the landscape might have looked like in 1491 with its full complement of beavers. And the big obstacle today, now the industrial fur trade is somewhat over. Pelt prices are very low. There's not a lot of commercial trapping, but we're still killing lots of beavers for nuisance reasons, or what we consider nuisance reasons. They're building dams and road culverts, or, chopping down people's apple trees, or flooding farm fields, or what have you. So, we need to, it's interesting. I think that, in the first phase of our relationship with beavers, we treated them as these kind of commercial commodities, essentially, that we only valued them for their pelts. Now we're in sort of the second phase where we're no longer killing them sort of industrially, but we still consider them pests or antagonists, and we need to move beyond that to the third phase, the third glorious phase, where we're kind of symbionts on the landscape together. So that's kind of where we've been and where we're trying to get to in the beaver world.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah, I remember a poignant scene in your book you describe. I think it might be how it starts, which is thinking about the dream scenario in your head of some beautiful mountain stream weaving its way through a meadow and a fly fishing guy or whatever. And then replacing that with just a swamp, basically, dammed up, water impounded, staying on the landscape for longer, actually getting into the reservoir, into the aquifer. So yeah, it's really fascinating. Just how quickly our vision of what natural is shifts. Ariel, I wanted to switch to you, switching gears really quickly. So, we described what you and Tree People do as community urban forestry. There were a lot of other things on that list. Tree People's been around for so long, but the founder of Tree People, Andy Lipkiss, who's no longer at the helm, has spoken at Bioneers a number of times. But I'm curious if you can kind of give us an overview of what your work with Tree People looks like. What does that actually look like on the ground? How does the work that you're doing fit into this larger concept of biophilic infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We've been around for 50 years and we've seen huge shifts where we were prioritizing nature-based solutions at the policy, research, implementation level, and we see it now happening. So that's exciting, is there is progress and there's still so much more that we need to do. I think I can help by telling you how I came to Tree People. And I'm going to say something shocking. It wasn't because of the trees. And I think that is fundamental to think of when we think about this movement that we're trying to build. We want to include everybody. It has to be inclusive, right? And what I've learned since coming to Tree People is that a lot of these concepts, people can understand, anyone can understand, but you just have to relay it in a way that is centered in community, in language. That speaks to community. So it's that's our mission at Tree People, to inspire, engage, and support people. We believe we are all Tree People. And we're really faced with some very daunting challenges. So if you want to bring up the image, we know that this work has to be rooted in environmental justice. So if you see this image here, I mean, this is truly, it looks like the same city, but the 12% canopy cover is in South LA. The 25% is in Studio City. And you can feel the difference right here in this image. So we know, all the benefits that trees bring and nature-based solutions bring. And that's why we have to center this work in the areas where there aren't trees, right? We have to start there. And we have to think about how it all connects. Next slide, please. Here's another sort of image of where we're at right now. This was a school, Main Street Elementary in South LA. And here, if you look at this image, it shares all of this environment, this built environment, what it does to our youth, our students, our educators. This is not a place for learning. Next slide, please. So we implemented a school greening project, and this is what it looks like. I don't know about you, but I take this huge breath of air, when I see this picture and this transformation. So we did this all with community, though. Before we asked community, we listened. What do you want? What do you need? And then we worked together with community, right, to do this project. And it was so beautiful. And I think that's what we've got to really prioritize and going forward. And that's what we do at Tree People. And we have to center stories, right? Our stories that we haven't been. It's not about buying the $20 water bottle, right? It's about my grandmother reusing her butter tub over and over and over again. What are the stories that we're telling so that we can advance together this movement? Because really, trees need people and people need trees. That's one of our biggest mottos. Our trees, we know, can't survive, our street trees, without people. And we know as people, we can't survive without trees. So really, it's this intrinsic, connection that we have and this movement building we have to do that will include everybody.
That is an amazing change in that schoolyard.
Right.
Well, that's a really good segue. So I wanted just to give Crystal a chance to introduce her work, which I think surprisingly will end up having a lot to do with trees needing people and people needing trees. So Crystal, I know a branch, or maybe all of your research, a big part of it anyway, focuses on natural solutions to wildfire disasters. My understanding is that we have a huge fire deficit in this country, which is hard to believe given all the fires that we see and hear about. I was hoping maybe we could get into this by seeing if you could help explain what that even means, a fire deficit, and how natural solutions might be a pathway towards resolving that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I get asked often. Well, how much fire is supposed to be here? It feels like there's already a ton, right? Especially every summer, when if you live in the West, you can go days or weeks on end without seeing the sun through a filter of smoke. And the reality is that prior to colonization, and not even colonization, but explicitly the demonization of fire, and it has very racist origins. It has very much origins in sort of capitalism, where timber barons looked at all of that virgin timber in the upper Midwest and then the Western U.S. and said, well, okay, if a fire burns this up, then it's not there for us to make money off of. So we need to put these fires out. And that is a big part of the origin of our Western and specifically US fire suppression policy, right? So how much burned before that? Well, it's actually a really tough question to answer, but some of the best estimates are that prior to colonization, that 20 to 30 million acres a year burned in the CONUS, the contiguous US, as we call it, which is the lower 48 states. And to put that in context, the last few years where we've had some of our biggest fire seasons on record, we've only burned about 10 million acres. And some of that came from Alaska. A lot comes from Alaska usually. So really, we have been for a century, right, developing this massive deficit of fire where, for a period in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we were burning less than 5 million acres a year. And that meant that there was this accumulation of land that wasn't being burned that evolved with fire, right? And so what we end up with is this landscape, and a lot of folks hear about sort of these overstocked forests or overly dense forests, and that's one piece of it. But a lot of that area that used to burn was actually in grasslands. The Great Plains were, a place that saw fire every 1, 2, 3 years, and those perennial grasses across the Great Plains, the native grasses, right, they burned so regularly and they just sprouted right back, right? It was a part of their evolutionary cycle. So when we look at the landscape today and we talk about this fire deficit, right, what we're talking about is the need for an amount of fire on average, right, annually, that basically maintains ecological process, right? And it's really different across different parts of the country. And in places where there are still native grasslands, those grasslands are happiest and healthiest when they burn every 1 to 5 years. In places where we get into dry pine forests, across the southeastern U.S., throughout the western U.S. at lower elevations, particularly on the lee side or the dry side of mountain ranges, it's every 5 to 30 years that those places would have burned, and primarily through indigenous ignitions, right, prior to colonization. And those are the places where we've seen this buildup of shrubs and spindly little trees, and a buildup and accumulation of what is now fuel for modern wildfires. And some of that landscape isn't burnable anymore. So when we talk about, well, okay, are we going to have to burn 20 to 30 million acres a year to sort of get back to a functional system? Well, the answer is probably not, because huge portions of the Great Plains are now converted to monoculture agriculture, right? That's a really different system now. And other places, climate change is rapidly altering that landscape. But in a lot of places, what that deficit looks like is that we need to reintroduce fire, and not the type of fire that people see in wildfires, right? We need to reintroduce low severity fire on a regular basis. And, I often say that low severity fire, the difference between that and high severity fire, well, high severity fire is what you see on the TV or your favorite internet news source in the middle of summer, when there's 100, 200-foot flame lengths coming off of this forest, and then whole towns burn down. That is high severity fire. And in most places, that is not the natural type of fire, right? Low severity fire, that's just 1,000 little campfires. And it is something that is, I like to think of it as if Bob Ross started painting fires in his paintings, it would be happy little flames, right? And that's low severity fire, and it sort of dances its way across the landscape, and it's not threatening, and it is something that is, doing this amazing good work. What I love about this panel is that all three of us are talking about different types of natural engineers, right? Beavers are on a very short timeline, very active engineers of waterscapes, and trees. We tend to forget that trees are actually actively engineering all the time, right? They're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. They're releasing oxygen back out as a product of photosynthesis, and they're also doing great things in the soil because they've got this root network and all these little microbes. Fire is another engineer, and it is an engineer that cleans up the forest floor, and that removes a lot of the detritus and leaves behind the nutrients that new plants need to grow, or that existing trees need to grow bigger, right? And so that's sort of this challenge that we face, is remembering that fire is an engineer, and if it is a low severity fire, if it's fire used in a way that forest or landscape evolved with, right, then it's a positive outcome. And the challenge for us as humans is to figure out how to fit back into that burning canvas. And the thing is, we don't have to try and play guessing games to figure out how to do it, because we've got great examples, both from indigenous knowledge. There are a lot of indigenous burners that still burn today in the U.S. They've defied decades of white colonists, and I'm a colonizer. I don't pretend to be indigenous in any way, shape, or form. But my colonizer ancestors basically said no more fire, right? And yet these people have persisted burning, and they carry that knowledge. And even in other parts of the U.S., we've got people today that have now multiple decades of burning experience. The Southeast has a massive burning program, and they're using fire as this tool. They're using it to engineer this landscape in a way that facilitates really positive outcomes and reduces the type of disastrous wildfires that nobody likes to see.
Yeah, my understanding is that literally the first law on the books in California was a law outlawing traditional burning. way back, like in the mission system.
Like the Spanish, yes. The Spanish showed up and started establishing missions in Southern California, and the native people, the Chumash and other tribes in Southern California, that was one of the control mechanisms, right? When fire is an integral part of your culture, outlawing fire is just as damaging as outlawing, for example, the ghost dance, which a lot of people are more familiar with as being a tribal cultural icon that was outlawed by the whites. So it's really amazing to think how long we've been slowly removing this thing that we need so much on these landscapes.
Well, let's talk about that. I think because one of the challenges when you think about ecological restoration or conservation or green infrastructure, urban forestry is this question of timescales. We function on a 60 to 80 year on average time frame in our sort of human animal bodies. Trees, depending on the tree, we might be into, centuries or millennia. And in terms of geologic processes, it's much longer, right? And it's one of the things that's terrifying about the Keeling curve and the kind of carbon dioxide hockey stick we're looking at is, we're doing geological work in a very short time period. But what I wanted to do is just spend a little time talking about timescales, and Ariel, maybe you can lead us off here, because it's particularly in urban forests, trees need people and over a long period of time. So it actually seems like, I'm interested to hear more about how you all establish your kind of community work such that trees actually thrive over the amount of time it takes for a tree to mature in a maybe less than natural setting. I don't know how many mother trees there are, as Suzanne Simard mentioned this morning, in even Studio City.
Right. Unfortunately, not many. And I think that is, when you talk about time, Teo, and decisions that are made, I think that's the shift we have to make. Is we can't have short fix solutions. When the LA River was built, I mean, there was a river there and then it was concretized, and that was to fix flooding, right? There was a massive flood that killed many people, but now we are dealing with serious ramifications because of all of that concrete. And so I think that's, the long-term solutions we have to think about. With trees, we know just by the simple act of planting a tree, it provides all those benefits that Crystal said. I mean, cleans the water, cleans the air. I mean, it does everything. And so what we need to think about is how to take care of our trees, because like you said, our urban environment at this point, if we don't help and we don't water those trees, they will die. And, we've seen that. And so why does tree people we're planting thousands of trees all over South LA, Southeast, Northeast San Fernando Valley, and Riverside. Why do we have a 99% survival rate? It's because we involve people. And so people come to our events, they have a lot of fun, they get their hands in that dirt, which there is nothing that can replace actually getting your hands in the dirt and feeling that land, feeling that connection. So that's the first thing, is reestablishing that connection. Because if you don't reestablish that connection, then you don't care, right? You don't want to put in that effort. You don't want to put in that love. And I kind of equate it a little bit to how much millennials and all of us love houseplants now. We can't just care about our houseplants, right? That tree in our parkway is a part of our community. And the trees on the street are a part of our community, and we have to take care of them. So it actually only takes, 3 5-gallon bucket, watering once a week during the summer and over the year to really take care of that tree. And so we all have to really take that ownership and that love and adopt our trees and nurture them and take care of them. And so our model is centered on, yes, planting the trees, but organizing. So I have a team of organizers. They're amazing. They're from and of the community, and they know how to speak to people their own community right to engage their community around these trees, because the trees, again, are not for other people. It's for the community. And I think that's really important. We're seeing issues of green gentrification, right? Areas where, yes, we want more parks, we want more trees. We provide that for community, and then community is driven out, right? And prices go up, and we're seeing gentrification everywhere in our cities. So connecting the local community to the trees that are being planted, not only for the survival of the trees, but the health of the community itself, right? And for the community. So investing in organizers, local, right? Local hires, and prioritizing reaching out to people in innovative ways. So not just your average host a workshop and come to me, but going to people, right? Showing up to a soccer league and talking about trees. If that community values soccer, those kinds of things, right, are the solutions that are really going to enable that connection that's necessary for nature to thrive in our urban cities.
Did you say you had a 99% survival rate for trees you plant?
We're very proud of it. We're very proud of it. But I'm it's, you know, that's why the community part, the people part is so important. We just don't have a choice anymore, right? In our urban cities. So yes, yeah, we are proud of that stat.
Ben and Crystal, anything on this concept of timescales and how we can kind of collectively expand our time horizons, or ways that we can kind of, I don't know, think like a beaver?
I think that one of the amazing things about beavers is that, you know, they are really geologic forces, right? You know, I mean, you behind a beaver dam, you know, you get all of this sediment accreting and building up over time, and they're creating floodplains over thousands and thousands of years. You know, they're really responsible for building our river valleys in a pretty significant way. And, you know, one of the unfortunate things that happens when you eliminate beavers from a landscape is that the landscape becomes less inhabitable for future beavers, right? In a kind of a beaver-rich stream, you know, all of those beaver dams are acting like speed bumps, kind of slowing the water down and spreading it out onto the floodplain. But when you lose all of those speed bumps and there's nothing checking the velocity of water, you get this really dramatic and rapid incision or erosion of the channel. It just cuts down to bedrock. And, you know, a floodplain that took thousands of years of beaver work to build up, you know, can become just completely sort of disconnected from the stream in a matter of years. And the problem with that, you know, is that once you get this very sort of incised, locked-in channel, that's a hard place for a beaver to live, right? Because the stream has become, you know, this fire hose blasting away any dam that a beaver would try to build. So we've got that's kind of the you know, the pernicious cycle that we've sort of trapped ourselves in some cases. Is, you know, by eliminating beavers, we've eliminated the landscape's capacity to carry beavers, which is why, you know, in many places around the West now, you know, you see stream restorationists experimenting with these beaver dam analogs, right? These sort of human-built beaver Kickstarter dams, where you pound a few posts into the stream bed and basically, you know, build up some sediment, try to bump the stream onto the floodplain, and, you know, give the beavers a bit of stable structure to build off of and potentially establish in that site. So, you know, I think that's an interesting thing to think about from a timescale perspective. You know, if all you cared about was sort of natural regeneration, you know, you might not have to do that sort of thing. Maybe, you know, given a few centuries, beavers would be able to reestablish in some of these streams. But, you know, we know that we have thousands and thousands of stream miles that are desperately degraded and need restoration help now. And, you know, these beaver dam analogs might be a way of kickstarting those processes and accelerating them and getting beavers to come back and settle in a watershed where they might not be able to settle otherwise. So, you know, the kind of the actions you take from a beaver restoration standpoint really depend on the time scales in which you're trying to restore a given stream, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, timescales are tough when as humans, we have a very short attention span. And I think it's only gotten shorter thanks to technology and modern social media and the 24-hour news cycle, right? And people want immediate gratification. And it's hard when a tree takes decades to grow into something that's big and beautiful and gives you the shade. And you know, beavers are, I've been amazed actually how quickly beavers can transform floodplains, particularly when they have a little bit of a head start, like Ben's talking about. And fire is particularly problematic for timescales because everything's gone in a flash. And it takes a long time for people to see how resilient these landscapes actually are. So you end up with, you know, and anyone that lives in the West the last few years, you know, maybe you've had a fire burn in your favorite place, and all you see now is black and ash and dead trees, or maybe you just see these pictures on TV because the media loves to show the immediate aftermath of severe wildfires, right? And what a lot of people don't do is then realize, oh, a few years later they're hiking through some place, and it takes them a minute to realize, oh, wait a minute, this is a place where there was a fire, right? I still see some, oh, there were some dead trees here, and you know, maybe there's a few things that are down on the ground and they're nurse logs now. But then there's also this incredible diversity of wildflowers, right? And that is very much one of the outcomes of that fire, but it can take a while depending on how severe it was, right? Or you don't see that over time. Using fire repeatedly gives you that sort of open park-like forest in many of our dry pine forests where fire evolved at such high frequencies, right? And I think one of the best examples of how we struggle with timescales with fire is that, you know, Yellowstone, our national, you know, crown jewel national park, right? When it burned in 1988, the Great Yellowstone fires burned 2/3 of the park. And at the time, there was this massive national mourning period, you know, because people thought that the park was gone, right? They'd never seen fire on that scale in that park. And anybody that goes to Yellowstone today, unless they're a forest or fire ecologist, they'd be hard pressed to actually figure out where those fires burned. That is a system that evolved with infrequent, very high intensity wildfire, and it is the fire is the catalyst in that system for lodgepole pine to sort of regenerate itself and go nuts again, right? And so it's what's really amazing is how much the fire actually changed the wildlife populations in the park, right? And allowed sort of this huge influx of wildfire or wildlife into areas that had sort of struggled to survive in because the habitat was you know, older, decadent forest, really dense. You know, people love elk and some of the other really large herbivores in places like Yellowstone, and when there's no habitat that is sort of open and patchy and can accommodate those giant antlers or those giant heads, you know, then you're going to see the wildlife going elsewhere. So it's hard because oftentimes what we're trying to do is convince people, I know you don't, all you see right now is the black, right? But in a few years, you're going to see this beautiful carpet of wildflowers. You're going to see, even next spring, right? You're going to see all this new grass. And in lower severity wildfires, next spring, you're going to see this massive nursery of baby trees that were just waiting for part of the canopy to burn so that the sun would reach the forest floor. And this is something that is, you know, part of what feeds into the fear of fire, right? Is our dislike of this aesthetically displeasing landscape, which is just the black and the ash and the brown. And when people don't see it frequently enough, they assume that that's what it's going to look like forever, right? They don't have that background or that understanding that, oh, you know, give it a few years and actually it's going to just explode with green and color and beauty, because I've never seen it before. And so we struggle with trying to convey, like, you know, Ariel's talking about community. what we struggle to convey to community, and when we talk to people, is I know that it feels like this is really not something you want to see, but you have to wait a couple years. Trust us, it's going to be gorgeous, right? And you're going to see the benefits of this, and you're going to see these trees be healthier and happier. And that is, that is why a lot of the work that we do in fire is also about community. And it's about getting people to reconnect with that sort of that primitive side of themselves. We all love fire. Fire is this massive. It is the thing that separates us as a species from almost every other species, right? We are the only species that learned how to make and control fire, and it is what catapulted us ahead in an evolutionary sense. Which is why anytime you go to a party, where's everybody at? Oh, they're in the kitchen, because that's where the hearth is. That's where the fire is. Or if you're outside in someone's backyard, there's a campfire, it's dark out, everybody goes to the fire. It doesn't matter where they were when sort of dark started to fall, they go to the campfire, right? And so what I do in a lot of the community outreach I do is try to appeal to people to think about that. Oh, you love campfires, right? Your kids love campfires. And when you go someplace where there's a fire and it starts to get dark, you go there because in an evolutionary sense, right? Your ancestors did this for protection, for food, for warmth, for all these things, right? And we can have that relationship with fire at a landscape scale as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think the that ability to harness fire, it's interesting. I'm trying to recall the name of Amory Lovin's book on the topic, Reimagining Fire or something. But the concept is, look, then we really got after it and started to burn everything. We just stopped burning some parts of it. So let me kind of transition from the science and ecology side of things a little more into the policy and climate areas, which have everything to do with community and fire and how those come together. So I want to talk quickly about just the idea of disasters, because we know one of the big ways that the climate crisis is going to affect us is in the increased frequency and scale of extreme events. I found this crazy stat the other day. In 2020, there were this is last year, there were 20, just in the US, 22 separate $1 billion+ disasters, which we spent $95 billion on. And that's just the dollars, right? There's lives lost, there's communities impacted. That's 2020. That was one of the biggest years since in the past 20 years. So we're talking about natural infrastructure, green infrastructure, community-based forestry, and they're all the reasons that it's good. I'm wondering if you can address ways that these investments in natural infrastructure, forest restoration, water management, community urban forestry, how those play into actually dealing with the disasters that are already coming. I mean, it was, Ariel, clearly that heat wave that hit Portland would have been even worse in a place that, I think Portland, just by having all the water, has more trees. I don't really want to think about a heat wave hitting LA like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I could go into that. It's interesting what you talk about, Crystal, with the media and what you see, right? You see these big weather events and they're devastating, and that's what's imprinted in people's mind. But most people don't know that extreme heat is the #1 weather-related killer. The #1 kills more people than fires, hurricanes, all of those combined. So, and we're feeling it. We're feeling it in Los Angeles. We're feeling it in the Inland Empire. We're feeling it across Southern California because we haven't adapted to the heat that has come, right? And that's why you saw so many deaths in Portland. people are losing their lives, you know, exacerbated by the heat. And what are the solutions? Trees, trees, cool surfaces. When we talk about fire, right? Tree People is restoring natives to our mountain areas, because we know, as Crystal said, they, you know, they're fire suppressants. They were built to be fire suppressant by nature. So I think we have to go back to, again, restoring these nature-based solutions. We know that there's been a drought. It's getting worse. We need drought-tolerant plants. We need to be getting rid of our, you know, European lawns, which is grass, right? And restoring back natives. And something you said also, Crystal, sparked how when you plant these little native plants, it doesn't look like much, but we show the after, and the, you know, the gardens are beautiful and amazing. And we have to get used to seeing that. We have to get used to seeing that type of imagery. So I think that's why we feel at Tree People our work is so urgent. We don't just want to plant a couple hundred trees. I mean, it's really going to take thousands and thousands to address urban heat, extreme heat. And for our communities, trees are a frontline defense. There's no money for air conditionings and cooling centers everywhere. I mean, cooling centers are going to be crucial to keeping people alive. But in terms of that long-term health, I mean, trees are going to save lives. And I think that's the part that a lot of folks are grappling with now. And that's what we talk to when we talk to our community members is, you know, this has really become a very serious situation. And so when we're looking at policy and we're looking at research, we need, you know, millions and billions invested in green infrastructure in trees. And we really hope to see that change. There were some historic policies passed here in California prioritizing green infrastructure in trees. We hope to see more with infrastructure bill federally. And I think that COVID has also shown us, right, that we need nature. It was a big kind of reawakening for a lot of people, reconnecting with nature. And so I think we'll see more policies and procedures that are supported in the green infrastructure, which will ultimately save a lot of lives going into the future.
Can I add something on to that, Teo?
Oh, please, yeah, go ahead.
You know, one of the things that there's been a lot of talk the last several years about, oh yeah, we need to plant more trees, right? And there was sort of this focus on, oh, there's the Trillion Trees Project, and you know, that's how we're going to suck all the carbon out of the atmosphere. That's going to save us from ourselves in terms of climate change. And what's so important about what Tree People is doing is that when people talk about the Trillion Trees Project and sort of this emphasis on planting trees, what they oftentimes point to are the exurban areas, right? The wild areas. Oh, we're gonna plant 1 trillion trees by going to all of this empty land where the humans are not, and we're just gonna put trees there, right? And for the fire scientists, when we started hearing people talk about going out and just planting lots of trees in the middle of nowhere, we sort of went, whoa, you can't do that. Especially not for carbon sequestration, because they're gonna burn, right? Because in so many of the places that have been identified in some of the interesting and widely debated science about planting 1 trillion trees, you know, and in some of the places that were identified as like, oh yeah, we could go plant, you know, we could go plant 500 million here. This would just knock out a huge chunk of it, right? A lot of those places are places where fire is endemic, and there's a lot of lightning. There's a lot of potential ignitions, and that is not necessarily the place that those trees are going to stay and actually become the mature trees that have all the carbon. Whereas in these urban systems where there used to be a lot of trees, right, and where there are people that can manage those trees, like Ariel's talking about, right? That's the place to plant 1 million trees or 1 trillion or 1 billion trees, right? Is focusing on where they can do the best work and where they don't have as much of an implication for actually increasing disastrous wildfires, because natural disasters are essentially disastrous only because of us humans, right? All these things happen long before humans are in these landscapes, whether it's floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, wildfires, whatever it may be. All these things were here before us, and it's our expansion of infrastructure and our attempt to control nature instead of working with it, that has left us vulnerable to having these disastrous outcomes. And Ariel's right. One of the greatest fatality events of the last 20 years was a massive heat wave in Europe, and I don't remember what year it was, that killed over 10,000 people, right? And you don't hear about heat waves, right? And so this is where there's sort of this this need in the policy side of it, right, to understand that, okay, we can't just go out and plant 1 trillion trees any old place we feel like it. We have to think about where this fits naturally with the existing biological and ecological systems, right? And where's the place where it's going to have the greatest impact in reducing those disastrous outcomes, which always, as Ariel mentioned, have the greatest impacts to the most vulnerable populations. So this is something that comes up a lot in the policy sphere with when people talk about trees. Is a lot of Congress people just sort of glommed onto the trillion trees thing as like, oh yeah, this is going to save us. We'll be fine if we just plant 1 trillion. But a big piece of it is understanding where to plant those trees, what kind of trees to plant. Right, and where those trees will actually have the greatest mitigation impacts to the most vulnerable populations, right? And yeah, that's a big piece of the policy discussion that sometimes just gets glossed over completely.
Yeah, well, before the panel started, we were talking about the infrastructure bill that just passed, and we can save the audience from going into the gory details, largely because I think our panelists are not claiming to be experts on the IIJA Act or whatever it's called. But Crystal and Ariel both said, look, the devil's in the details. And I can just tell you really quickly for people to know, in that bill, $47 billion is appropriated for climate resilience projects, right? And so natural infrastructure is going to be some slice underneath that. The American Forests said they think the legislation will lead to around 15 million acres of forest being reforested and restored, and an additional, I guess, 500 million for natural infrastructure resilience to reduce flooding and manage stormwater for urban forests and tree planting. And when you look at 95 billion as an annual cost, more or less every year, 47 billion seems like a drop in the bucket. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I'll take the $47 billion. These numbers are all just absurd. They're tossing them out. But it does really sound like the devil's in the details. It's incredible after this many years of understanding that we need more fire in the landscape, that we still largely, for example, have a federal policy focused on putting them out. So I think there is, there's some requirement for a big shift. Let me just ask one, I guess, kind of big. This is Bioneers. We're allowed to ask like big, weird questions. So I'll just go for it as we're kind of rounding the corner into the last section of this conversation. All three of you deal really specifically with the kind of interface between humans and the natural world, right? That's come up in everything that we're talking about, and that's fundamentally, at the root of all of this. This is a freshman, philosophy paper here. I'm just not breaking any news. But here we are. Biophilia is in the title of the panel. It's an interesting hypothesis. I'm curious from your different perspectives, like what is it going to take? Why is it so darn hard for us to figure out how to do this right? I'll add one other thing, which is if you read Ben's book about beavers, and you look up the beaver believer concept, like there's some really hopeful things when people find out about these solutions. They get really excited. At some level, that's the core purpose of the Bioneers conference, is to expose people to really exciting solutions. So yeah, what's it going to take?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, certainly, beavers aren't quite as magnetic as the hearth, but I think, if you had a beaver in your kitchen, the guests would probably gravitate. They are kind of these amazingly magnetic animals, and I mean, just getting out in the field with them and experiencing nature more, I think, is really, really vital, because you can't help but watch these animals and see the landscapes they create and be impressed by them. But I mean, to me, I think that in the beaver world and in so many worlds, we need to embrace dynamism again on our landscapes. Crystal was talking about the inherently cyclic nature of fire, and beavers do something similar. A beaver, initially a beaver pond, is this wonderful kind of deep impoundment that's fantastic fish habitat, and then it gradually sediments in over time and becomes, a wetland, which is wonderful for amphibians and waterfowl, and then, becomes a kind of a lush wet meadow, which is great ungulate forage. So, so beaver habitats are inherently transitional, like a lot of natural landscapes are, and I think that's not what we like as humans, right? We like our infrastructure very much fixed in place. We like our roads and our rail lines and our power lines and our towns to kind of stay where you put them, and to be as static as possible. So, to me, I think that we need to embrace dynamism again, to recognize that, hey, landscapes are inherently transitional in all kinds of ways. And that, just as a black forest scape, isn't maybe unattractive to some people, but is really just an important stage in this greater process. That's also true of a beaver impoundment, where there are dead and dying trees everywhere, and it kind of smells funky, and the water's not free flowing and fast moving like we like it. Beavers they modify landscapes in ways that are kind of anathema to us as humans in some cases. And we need to recognize that these dynamic processes are absolutely integral to ecological health and our own well-being as a species.
You want to go, Crystal?
Go for it. Well, I'm a scientist, so I tend to be very bimodal in that I have strong optimism on one hand and extreme cynicism on the other hand. And the thing is, my optimism lies in the people I see in front of me, and the people that are in the audience who are looking at this going, yeah, you know what, we can do this. Nature is amazingly resilient, and if we work with nature, we can do this. And my cynicism lies in the fundamental reason that we got ourselves into this mess in the first place, which is capitalism. And what I look at is that if one of the primary barriers to actually embracing a lot of these biophilic solutions is that people haven't figured out how to make money off of it yet. And that is going to, I think that we're seeing more and more entrepreneurs looking at these types of biophilic solutions and saying, okay, how can I form a company around this? Obviously, the carbon question is going to drive a lot of this. And we're seeing this in California, where we've now got companies popping up all over the place, looking at how do we actually exist in a place where we have a carbon market. And I look at something like Tree People and think, okay, there's a lot of reasons why tree people are planting trees and transforming landscapes. And at this point in time, communities are doing that to help themselves, but they're also probably not getting any carbon credits for it, right? And is that something that somebody is going to come along and try and monetize, which is monetization tends to be the root of all these things, and it's the reason that we have a climate change problem in the first place, as COP26 so devastatingly just demonstrated with its complete lack of commitment to changing any of that. So, that's the reason beavers, you talk about barriers. I live in California, where you literally cannot transport beavers to new locations still, because of this, this legacy of farmers running the show, and the farmers and ranchers being worried about beavers destroying their assets and their profit margins, right? So that's this ancient policy that needs to change. So there's always this sort of clash between capitalism and what's a better social good. And what I look at is, I see a lot of these young entrepreneurs who are saying, okay, can we figure out how to monetize this? And I think that and a desire from a large population to have a civilization where social good is foremost, is what's going to get us there.
Right. So if there's like an Uber for beavers, where you could charge some nonprofit to shuttle them around, that would take off, I bet.
No, I mean, I think it's enabling innovative solutions to thrive and come to the forefront. I think for me, it's constantly questioning your power, who's at the table, who's not. I wish I could see you all and see, who's in this virtual room, but you all have power, right? And you can all ask yourselves when you're at a table, who's at the table and who's not. And quite often, who's not at the table are community members and Indigenous people and communities of color. So I think it's questioning those things, right? Recently, Tree People has been doing a lot of water equity work in partnership with 12 environmental justice community-based orgs and an Indigenous partner, Sacred Places Institute. And we did a strengths and needs assessment of the entirety of LA County, focused on underserved communities. And sometimes I get lost in the amount of people that are in LA County. There are 10 million people. 1 in 33 people in the United States live in LA County. I mean, it is a petri dish, right? And something like 150 nationalities. I mean, we really are a petri dish for where solutions can happen. And we passed Measure W at the end of 2019, which was the largest investment of stormwater capture, right, projects. This is about $250 to $300 million every single year. It does not sunset. And it includes nature-based solutions and watershed coordinators, which are basically organizers, right? And that was because people rose up and said, this is what we want. This is what we want in the legislation, right? This is what we want to get passed, and then it got passed. So I think it's bringing people to the forefront. It's giving them that voice and not assuming that they're stupid, that they wouldn't understand stormwater capture. It's a pretty easy concept. It's just about the language, right? So I'm a broken record here, but really it's a people movement. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that. We saw that at COP26. We're seeing it in protests. It's that inclusive people building movement that will get us to those solutions, because without that, we're again making decisions with this small power structure of elites, right? I forget, there was a panelist on Thursday that was incredible that says, our cities and our landscapes are just the imaginations of the elite. We need to change that, right? Change that dynamic. And I think we're moving. I feel optimistic. We're moving. We're making the largest investments than we ever have in green infrastructure. But we need to do more, and it's gonna come from unlocking those voices and prioritizing community and organizing, I think.
Absolutely. That was Deanna Van Buren, I think you're thinking.
Yes, that's her.
Speaker, architect, designer, designing justice, designing spaces. It's her work, and yeah, I couldn't agree more. Hey, so on that front, you kind of led us right to where I wanted to go, Ariel, which is, if this is the same type of crowd that attends many Bioneers conferences, you all in the audience are activists. You are here because you want to learn and do. And so I wanted to really make sure we take a cycle through our panelists to talk about projects that they're excited about, specific details and ways that people can get involved. How can you get involved at the local level in terms of community forestry, in terms of the more good fire on the landscape, ecological restoration, beaver restoration in your zone. I guess if we could just take a round and dive in that'd be great. Whoever wants to start can, or I can pick someone.
Sure, I'll just say that so one of the things about beavers is that unlike fire, you've got this one giant agency, the Forest Service, that really drives fire management in the United States. Beavers are this hyper local issue whose fate is really determined by lots of little county commissions, town councils, municipal whatevers. Yes, there are. Of course, there are state regulations like the one that Dr. Colden described that make relocation difficult. But as I said earlier, most of the beavers that are killed are these sort of quote unquote nuisance animals that are damming in road culverts and the like. And the kind of the policies for dealing with those animals, those quote unquote nuisance animals, falls to these hyper local units of government that can really be influenced by people. And there are all kinds of wonderful examples around the country. Martinez, California, being one really prominent one of places where just a very small group of concerned citizens have gone to, again, a local governmental body, and really influenced the trajectory of beaver populations, and gotten some really progressive regulations in place. So that's what I would say is that if you as an activist choose to take up beavers as your cause, it's one that you can really influence at a local level. So figure out who's in charge of managing the county roads. And has signed the kind of in perpetuity contract with the local trapper to eliminate beavers from every culvert, and get that contract changed. And that's happened in many cases, and is certainly very possible. So beavers, very local issue that any person can influence, which is one of the wonderful things about them.
Ben, I would actually counter you and say that that's the same is true for fire. There's a perception that it's controlled by the U.S. Forest Service, and that may be, the federal agencies control fire on federal lands. But in most states, with the exception of a few of the Western states, there are huge chunks of state land that people can burn on. And one of the most powerful things that we have coming out of private communities now, and this is Ariel's point about community is so valid here, that people are basically taking fire in their own hands and saying, we're tired of being terrified of wildfires and we're going to start burning. And this has happened for a long time in the Southeast. People burn there every year, and now we're seeing it in the West as well. California now has a system of what we call prescribed burn associations. So when Teo introduced me, we burn on my place here, and we're burning to heal the oaks and try and bring back some of the native grasses that have been pushed out by a lack of fire. And we're trying to get other community members involved in our local prescribed burning association who may not have ever burned in their lives. They don't even know where to start. But it turns out that the first time you get a drip torch in your hand and you get to start doing it yourself, it's really actually a lot of fun. And it's incredibly empowering for people to actually use fire on their own property, on their neighbor's property, in local, state, local, municipal is relevant here too, because the local municipalities can decide if they want to burn in their parks, on their their lands that are reserved for water and things like that. So you can definitely get involved at the local level, and and we're seeing this spread across the West, where people are saying, yeah, you know what, we're tired of waiting for the Forest Service or whoever to show up. We want to burn. We want to protect ourselves.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir about just planting a tree. So that's the first thing. I think we just need to plant as many trees as we can and take care of them. That's the second piece. It's not just planting. You talked about the trillion tree all of that stuff sounds so flashy, and there's no, there's no pictures of after. Are these trees alive? Are they okay? Are they thriving? So let's take care of our trees. If you're in the Southern California region, we host so many volunteer events. Come out, volunteer. But really, I think it's just taking an action, whatever action that is, and getting out of your bubble, right? If you're in an area with a lot of trees or you have access to nature, get out of your bubble a little bit, because we're all connected, right? Our communities are all connected. So understand what it feels like to be in another community, understand that community, understand how we're connected so that we can advocate for each other, and move forward and show up to places, public forums, things like that, so you can advocate for everyone, and not just for yourself. And again, reevaluate your power. Who can you bring to the table to advance our Indigenous communities' voices, and our communities of color?
Taylor, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Well, look, we are out of time. We could keep going for hours. It looks like I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I think my colleague on the back end here is going to drop some links into the chat. But there's so much more to learn about what all three of these incredible folks are doing. Read Ben's book, Eager. There's an excerpt and a great interview with him on the Bioneers website. Crystal and I spoke. That's on Bioneers. And Tree People has its own spectacular website with acres and acres of information. So go check it out. Thank you all so much. You're really an inspiring crew. And, more of all of what you're doing in the world, and we'll be in good shape. Thank you again so much for coming.
Thanks to you all.
Thank you, Ben and Crystal. Thank you, Teo, and everybody here.